Namaste, I am Prafull Ketkar. I am editor of Organizer, a weekly magazine, and close China watcher for a long time. Today we are going to discuss about India-China relations and the Chinese strategic interest in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Otherwise, whenever we discuss India-China relations, generally Pakistan factors come in between. But when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir, there are independent factors that impinge upon the Bharat-China bilateral relationship. Frankly speaking, India and China are civilizational states, and their bilateral relationship goes beyond at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. We have had trade linkages, educational linkages, cultural and religious ties, and still we didn't fight with each other. What was so special civilizationally that we shared this perspective of coexistence? And perhaps the beauty of the Hindu civilization and the Confucius civilization was that it celebrated diversity. It taught us to respect each other's point of views, and told us that all ways can lead to the same ultimate truth. And that's why perhaps Chinese scholars didn't have any problem in adopting and adapting Buddhism from India, or for that matter, the entire world came to know about Bharat and its spiritual legacy through the notes, the diaries, and the anecdotes written by Chinese scholars about India. So, we have this civilizational legacy, and still generally India and China are perceived as competitive and conflicting neighbors. I feel that primarily because of with the Islamic aggression, especially in the 12th and the 13th century, Bakhtiyar Khilji burning Nalanda and Takshashila as the main academic institutions actually ruptured our bilateral relations. The philosophical exchange, the religious and cultural exchange somehow stopped for next 2 to 3 centuries, and we revived our ties only during the British period. So we started seeing each other from the British point of view. After independence, India was caught in its own issues. China had undergone the communist revolution, and then we started seeing each other from the Cold War perspective. And then in the era of globalization, largely we see each other from the American perspective. And that's why emergence of Asian giants, competitive neighbors, conflicting neighbors, these are the popular cliches that are being used to explain the relationship between the so-called tiger and the so-called dragon. So, because we are caught in the European paradigm of understanding these two important Asian countries, we have to understand the power dynamics and the strategic perspective that China has evolved during the Cold War period, and that is carried forward in the post-Cold War period. In 2015 onwards, there has been some interesting developments. For instance, in China, a representative of 70 countries came together, and they listened to the Chinese topmost leader Xi Jinping, who is considered as the leader, not just the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and perhaps after Mao Zedong, believed to be the most powerful leader of China. He gave a presentation on his mega plan. And the mega plan, which he actually started in 2013, initially it was called as the OBOR, the Belt and Road Initiative is the popular name that is being used today. And he gave a presentation of a mega project, mega infrastructural project connecting 65 countries from Asia Pacific, eastern part of Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia and Central Asia up to the Eastern Europe. $4 trillion is the investment that China has committed in this project. This entire project plans to connect all these regions not just by roads but also by ports. The power grids are supposed to be integrated, and many other infrastructural initiatives are being taken. Of course, China expected India to be on the board, and perhaps India was the only major country of the region that defied the Chinese diktat. And that really shows what kind of power dynamics that is emerging between these two important countries. And there comes the entire issue of Jammu Kashmir and the sovereign rights of India over the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But we will come to that later. First, try and understand what are the larger issues that China is going to play and address through this mega project of Belt and Road Initiative. This is not just connecting the most part of the developing world. Almost 2/3 of the population is covered. 65 countries are covered. Major supply chain is covered. So virtually China is going to be trying to go to the next level of being world's biggest manufacturing hub. And with the strong economic interference in all these countries, China will have a say over almost all kinds of resource mobilization on these routes. Karakoram Highway, or what is popularly discussed today is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is just a part of it. Of course, from Indian point of view, that is the most important part. But if we look at the strategy, if we look at the larger interests, then it looks like China has a mega plan to be a new colonial power of the 21st century. So, control over resources. Another important aspect in all these projects is the actual participant countries have very little interest to protect, but they will be somehow in the debt trap where China can eventually influence their all decision making and policy formulation processes. So, the first fear that Indian policymakers and even globally it has been spoken about is that it is a strategy to virtually colonize the entire East Europe to Southeast Asian or Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. Of course, it will help China to supply goods, manufacture goods with a high speed connectivity. It will influence the markets of all those countries, but more importantly, it is also giving very important strategic access to China, to the Indian Ocean region, to the African continent, to the European continent. And therefore, Gwadar to Kashgar, this is the belt which is most important from Chinese point of view. Again, India comes in the picture. This is the old Karakoram highway. Infrastructural facilities in Shasgam and Hunza Valley have been a bone of contention. Illegally, they are acceded to China by Pakistan. So all these factors come when we discuss this Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping, through this bold move, actually wants to consolidate his position, the position of the Chinese Communist Party within China. We need to understand that internally, China has become a economic giant through mega infrastructure projects. Now that domestic part is over, now to sustain that growth, China needs investment in other parts of the world. Otherwise, as we have been experiencing, the Chinese growth rate of 8%, 9% is consistently going down for last 3 to 4 years. So China is hoping to use this Belt and Road Initiative project as a kind of infusion to even Chinese domestic economy. And who is the biggest hurdle? And if we see the entire gamut of the countries that are there on the route, India is perhaps the only country that has not bent to the Chinese pressures. And that's why China is using all the techniques, all the tactics, all the strategies to get India on board. For example, Chinese massive investment in Sri Lanka, Chinese investment in Gwadar, Chinese investment in Myanmar and Bangladesh. All this is part of the string of pearl strategy. At the same time, what China is trying to do is to corner India in international organizations. So Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar was supposed to be sanctioned, and thrice the proposal came in the United Nations Security Council, but China used the veto power. India was supposed to get the access to the nuclear suppliers group, so that the major supply chain as far as the nuclear raw material is concerned, uranium supply is concerned, could have been solved. Again, China tried to block Indian entry in the NSG. All these are nothing but the strategies to pressurize India to join the mega plan of Belt and Road Initiative. So for China, there is something, or rather everything is at stake. So economy is at stake, stability is at stake, and the long cherished dream of being world superpower is at stake. And only hurdle that is in between is India. And why this particular stage becomes more important? Simply because the entire road connectivity, the entire port connectivity, the entire dam projects, entire power grid connectivity, everything is dependent on this important stretch called CPEC. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor passes through Gilgit-Baltistan and connects up to Balochistan. This is the most important portion as far as China's strategic interest and connectivity is concerned. So if we see the map, we can clearly identify the Kashgar port of China and the access up to the Gwadar port. Without that, China cannot complete this project. Second important aspect of this is the use of Chinese labor and Chinese technology in this region. China has already built a lot of infrastructure in this region because illegally from Pakistani side they have already occupied this territory. But this is the biggest concern that India has, and India has raised and resisted the Chinese pressure only on this ground that China is actually using the constitutionally sovereign territory of India to further its strategic interests, global ambitions. We need to understand that China is a revisionist power. China is coming up on the basis of challenging the US as the sole global power. And so China wants to completely change the equations on the ground. And the best way to do that is to have access to the raw material, have control over supply chain, and the monopoly over the connectivity part of it. Every time in human civilization, colonial powers have used these tactics. China is also trying the same. But while doing so, China is riding too much on the power or the tested friend and a nuclear power called Pakistan, which is very unreliable power, irresponsible power. And therefore, without discussing the Pakistan angle and the Jammu Kashmir issue, we cannot actually deal with the entire India-China relations. And of course, China tries to bring in the Dalai Lama issue or the Arunachal Pradesh issue in bilateral talks, but as we all know, what we have with China as a British legacy is the boundary dispute. Some of the boundaries are not clearly demarcated, and that's why these issues come up. But the moment that is on the eastern part, but the moment we come to the northern part, there we actually come to the disputed territory, and the disputed territory is basically to some extent the most important strategically is Aksai Chin, but equally important is the entire area of Gilgit-Baltistan and especially the Hunza and Shabsgam Valley. So China expects India to cooperate. The Chinese logic is, okay, we are doing this project for the larger human interest, to share development with all others. If you cooperate, then eventually once the dispute between India and Pakistan is settled, we will deal with India. But this is against the basic principle of sovereignty. For instance, nobody has asked this question to China, but as researchers, as scholars, as policymakers, we should look into it. whether China will allow any project to pass through, for example, Tibet, without the Chinese consent. And that's what exactly China has done as far as the CPEC is concerned, or for that matter, earlier Karakoram Highway is concerned. So, there are multiple issues that are involved, and those issues have a direct bearing over the entire complexities that are involved in Jammu and Kashmir, and that's how international players come in the picture. So, though the legally Jammu Kashmir is an integral part of India, the accession is complete. The entire region of Jammu Kashmir, as per the consent of the Maharaja of Jammu Kashmir, Raja Hari Singh, it acceded to India, and still we directly don't have a control over that region. It's not just because of Pakistan, it's because the way great powers played their game through Pakistan in the region of Jammu and Kashmir. Earlier, other great powers were also playing important games. British played their own game, America played its game, but now perhaps China is the most important player, because China has the direct connectivity, direct interest, direct border sharing in this region. And therefore, India not just resisted, but again and again raised these points. Now, because Belt and Road Initiative, besides the boundary dispute, is the most critical issue as far as India-China relations, we need to understand that primarily India is raising the issue of sovereignty, then monopoly over the resources, that is the new colonial mindset, then participation of locals. Everywhere where Chinese projects are going, locals are not taken on board, their consent is not taken, they are not actual participant in the development projects. Most of the places Chinese are taking their own labors. So, of course, all these things are building up. How to address this? One way is, of course, the way India is doing, but taking all other players in this game on board is also very critical. Eventually, smaller countries or less developed countries will understand that this is a debt trap, so they will also resist the Chinese pressures. The great game that is being played between China and America, that will also have an impact. But eventually, I personally feel that reviving the civilizational wisdom is the key to address the India-China issue. The eminent scholar like Yuan Song traveled from the northern parts of China almost via Central Asia. He stayed in Himalayas. He came down to the prominent Buddhist centers, including Nalanda. And he never had issues while translating Indian philosophy and Indian wisdom in Chinese, and in China also it was accepted and celebrated. This tradition goes up to Dr. Kotnis, when Dr. Kotnis went there and served the Chinese people in the Second World War. So we have somewhere this civilizational connect, and the forces that ruptured this civilizational connect are not just Bakhtiyar Khilji. Bakhtiyar Khilji symbolizes the mindset, and the mindset goes down up to Jaish-e-Mohammed or Lashkar-e-Toiba. So, unless we pass on this clear-cut understanding of the issue that you are actually promoting and supporting the same mindset that crushed our civilizational wisdom. And that has to be communicated to the Chinese mind, Chinese scholars, Chinese policymakers. Communist state may find it difficult to understand, but there is all potential to have a civilizational dialogue with China. Are we exploring that? Do we understand that? Or we see China only from the Cold War or American or Pakistani perspective? That is the real thing. China is not just Beijing, as India is not just Delhi. So, having wider understanding about the issues, the scars of 1962 are definitely there, but we have to come out of it and develop a new kind of understanding. I believe the kind of informal dialogue that has started between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, the kind of informality they have shared is a good sign to go in that direction. But ultimately, yes, Belt and Road Initiative cannot be without the participation of the locals. It cannot be just with the Chinese investment, and it cannot go through or pass through the Indian sovereign territory without the consent of the Indian state. These are the basic fundamentals that is going to decide how India-China relationship evolves, how Chinese strategic interest in Jammu Kashmir are going to play, and ultimately how it boils down to the larger resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir once and for all. But for that, understanding the idea of Bharat, the larger concept of Bharatvarsh, the geocultural identity of ourselves as a nation is very important. I hope with this kind of interaction, with this kind of proposition, we can see the Sharda Peeth, the Shankaracharya Hills with a new perspective as our geocultural symbols, our national symbols, and perhaps they will give us a larger path to understand and explore Jammu Kashmir from not just the strategic and power perspective as Anglo-Saxon civilization would like us to see, but as our geocultural symbols of connectivity. Connectivity is more psychological and cultural and spiritual from Indian point of view. Somewhere we need to use that soft power. We need to use that the spiritual connect, cultural connect to address the issue and understand and explore the bilateral relationship with China with a more positive and constructive approach without bending to the pressures of Chinese communist state. Thank you.